After the Norman Conquest of 1066, England became a land that needed to be controlled as much as it needed to be ruled. William the Conqueror did not rely only on loyalty or oaths. He relied on stone, height, and fear. Windsor was chosen not because it was already important, but because it could be made important. Rising above the River Thames, the hill offered command over a vital route between London and the West. From this elevated ground, power could be seen and felt. The earliest Windsor Castle was not a palace, but a statement, an assertion that conquest was permanent and resistance was futile. The first structure was a classic Norman motte and bailey fortress, quickly assembled from earth and timber. Speed mattered more than comfort. Timber walls, wooden towers, and a raised mound allowed Norman forces to dominate the surrounding Saxon landscape almost immediately. These early castles were instruments of occupation, not homes. They housed soldiers, stored supplies, and served as administrative centres for newly seized lands. For the local population, Windsor was not a symbol of unity, but of submission. A constant reminder that a foreign elite now ruled England. Control of territory was only one part of the Norman strategy. Psychological dominance mattered just as much. Castles like Windsor were placed where they could be seen from afar, interrupting familiar horizons. The presence of armed men behind high walls changed how people moved, traded, and lived. Roads adjusted, settlement shifted. The landscape itself was reorganized around power. Windsor became a focal point in a network of fortresses designed to surround London, ensuring that rebellion in the capital could be crushed from multiple directions. As Norman rule stabilized, Windsor began to evolve. What started as a military outpost slowly gained royal importance. Kings recognized that its position was not only defensible, but strategic in governance. From Windsor, a ruler could move swiftly between royal estates, monitor the Thames corridor, and remain close enough to London without being vulnerable inside it. This balance between distance and access made Windsor uniquely valuable. It was both a refuge and a command post. Stone replaced timber as Norman authority became less fragile. The transformation was deliberate and symbolic. Stone walls communicated endurance, wealth, and legitimacy. The central mound was crowned with a massive stone keep, later known as the Round Tower, dominating the surrounding countryside. Each phase of rebuilding reinforced the idea that Norman rule was no longer temporary occupation, but inherited right. The castle's growing complexity reflected a kingdom transitioning from conquest to continuity. Windsor also became a testing ground for royal power during moments of crisis. Rebellions, baronial unrest, and dynastic disputes repeatedly proved the value of a stronghold that could withstand sieges and provide secure shelter. The castle's defences were challenged, adapted, and strengthened over generations. Every assault left lessons etched into its architecture: thicker walls, improved gates, better controlled access points. Warfare shaped Windsor as much as royal ambition did. Over time, the harsh military character of the early Norman fortress softened, but it never disappeared. Even as royal apartments expanded and ceremonial spaces emerged, the underlying structure remained one of control. Windsor was never allowed to become merely decorative. Its walls continued to speak of authority backed by force, of a monarchy that understood survival depended on preparedness. The castle's evolution did not erase its origins, it layered power upon power. What makes Windsor distinctive is not just its age, but its uninterrupted role. Few castles move so seamlessly from conquest tool to royal residence without losing their strategic purpose. The Norman decision to build here set in motion a chain of use, rebuilding, and reinvention that never truly broke. Beneath later Gothic splendour and royal pageantry lies the logic of 11th century conquest. A fortress born to dominate, adapted to rule, and never allowed to forget why it was built. Windsor is often described with a claim that sounds almost too neat to be true. The oldest inhabited castle in the world, still used as a royal residence. What makes that statement feel uncanny is not simply the age of the walls, but the continuity of purpose. Castles usually become ruins, museums, or romantic backdrops. Windsor stayed alive. It kept being slept in, guarded, expanded, repaired, modernised, and reshaped, century after century, while the monarchy itself changed faces, languages, religions, and political limits. The secret is that Windsor never belonged to a single moment in history. It was not frozen as medieval or Tudor or Victorian. Each generation treated it like a working machine that had to function, not just impress. When warfare evolved, the defensive logic was adjusted. When court life demanded spectacle, new ceremonial spaces appeared. When privacy became a royal necessity, secluded routes, enclosed courtyards, and controlled entrances gained importance. Even the way the castle is organised, layers of wards, walls, and gates, helped it adapt, because it could be modified in sections without shutting down the whole organism. Its long life is also tied to geography and politics. Windsor sits close enough to London to matter, but far enough to feel like a retreat. Monarchs could escape the pressure of the capital without leaving the orbit of power. That distance became especially valuable when London was unstable. During plague years, political turmoil, or moments when crowds were unpredictable. A royal residence that doubled as a fortress offered something palaces rarely could: the ability to shut the world out without appearing to vanish entirely. The castle's setting above the Thames corridor also kept it woven into the country's movement and communication, never turning remote or irrelevant. Continuity, however, does not mean comfort. Living in a 1,000-year-old castle is a constant argument between tradition and reality. Windsor had to be heated, lit, supplied, staffed, and defended through eras that had wildly different standards. What counted as modern shifted from fireplaces to chimneys, from candles to gaslight, from gaslight to electricity, from horse stables to motor garages. Every upgrade had to be threaded through stone corridors and ancient structures, often hidden, so the illusion of timelessness could survive. The building became a stage set that constantly underwent renovations behind the curtain. The castle's inhabited status is also about ritual as much as residence. Windsor is not simply where monarchs stay, it is where monarchy performs itself. Ceremonies, investitures, and formal gatherings turn the site into a living political theatre. The medieval association with chivalric tradition, especially through the Order of the Garter, gave Windsor a role that other royal homes could not replace. That kind of ceremonial gravity creates a reason to keep returning. As long as the monarchy wants a place that looks and feels like deep continuity, Windsor provides it in stone. Then there's the question of survival through catastrophe, the moments when many historic buildings lose their continuity. Wars, revolutions, fires, and political collapses end habitations abruptly. Windsor, remarkably, kept being used even when the modern world threatened to swallow old symbols whole. In the 20th century, it was not merely preserved, it was actively relied upon. At times of danger, The castle's controlled access and security infrastructure made it a natural stronghold. Its very age, once a military feature, became a modern advantage. Thick walls, limited approach routes, and an environment designed for guarding. That continuity was tested brutally by disaster in a different form: fire. When a major blaze tears through a historic residence, the question becomes immediate and existential. Does it remain a living place, or does it become a monument to what was lost? Windsor's response was not to retreat into museum status. Restoration was driven by the logic of use. Rebuild not as a lifeless replica, but as a functioning royal setting that could host events, hold collections, and remain operational. The work exposed another reason Windsor stays inhabited. It is backed by a state-level commitment to keep it not just standing, but working. If you walk through Windsor in your mind as a timeline, the eerie part is how many different Windsors exist in the same footprint. A fortress designed to intimidate conquered land, a medieval royal court with strict hierarchy and ceremony, a later royal residence shaped by taste, fashion, and politics, a modern site with security protocols, climate control, and global media attention. The castle's uninterrupted life is not a miracle of preservation. It is a history of constant negotiation, where every century leaves a new layer, and the building keeps accepting those layers without collapsing under them. Windsor Castle functions less as a backdrop and more as a physical language through which English monarchy speaks. Its walls, towers, and courtyards do not merely enclose space, they encode authority. Every architectural choice, from elevation to enclosure, reinforces the idea that power is both visible and distant. Unlike ceremonial crowns or regalia that appear briefly, Windsor stands permanently, shaping how monarchy is imagined, even when no monarch is present. The building itself becomes a proxy for the crown, translating abstract authority into stone and scale. One of the most striking elements is vertical dominance. The castle rises above its surroundings in a way that feels intentional rather than natural. Height has always been a political tool, and Windsor uses it relentlessly. From the round tower to the layered wards below, the eye is guided upward, towards structures associated with command and oversight. This upward movement mirrors the social hierarchy the monarchy depends on: subjects below, sovereign above. Even when military defence became secondary, the vertical language remained because symbolism outlived necessity. The spatial organisation of Windsor reinforces controlled access to power. Movement through the castle is never straightforward. Gates, courtyards, staircases, and corridors are arranged to filter presence and status. Not everyone approaches the same way, and not every space is equally accessible. This architectural choreography mirrors court protocol, where proximity to the monarch signals rank. Architecture here does not simply house ritual, it performs it. To move deeper into Windsor is to move closer to authority, both physically and symbolically. Ceremonial architecture plays a crucial role in turning monarchy into continuity rather than personality. Grand halls, chapels, and processional routes are designed to host repeated acts, investitures, oaths, commemorations that link one reign to another. These spaces diminish the individual ruler and elevate the institution. When a monarch stands in St. George's Chapel or processes through the state apartments, the setting insists that this figure is temporary, while the monarchy is not. Stone outlasts flesh, and the architecture makes that hierarchy unmistakable. Windsor's symbolism is also rooted in selective memory. The castle does not present history evenly. It curates it. Medieval elements are emphasized, revived, and sometimes exaggerated, even when later periods altered or replaced them. Gothic revival features, heraldic imagery, and chivalric references are not accidents of taste, but deliberate statements. They anchor the monarchy in a deep, almost mythic past, smoothing over ruptures such as civil war, religious conflict, or political reform. Architecture becomes a tool of narrative control, shaping how continuity is perceived, rather than how it actually unfolded. The relationship between Windsor and the Crown is further strengthened by repetition. Monarchs return here for the same rituals, occupy the same spaces, and are framed by the same visual language as their predecessors. Over time, this repetition creates legitimacy through familiarity. The castle teaches subjects what monarchy looks like. Even viewers who never visit in person recognise Windsor as a shorthand for royal authority, because its imagery has been endlessly reproduced, broadcast and staged as the visual core of the institution. Power at Windsor is not only displayed, it is stabilised. The castle absorbs change without appearing to change. Constitutional limits on royal authority, the rise of Parliament, and the transformation of monarchy into a symbolic role all unfolded without dislodging Windsor from its position. The architecture adapted quietly, allowing political reality to shift while visual authority remained intact. This separation between appearance and function is one of Windsor's greatest strengths as a symbol. It reassures continuity, even when power itself has been redistributed. What ultimately makes Windsor such a potent emblem is that it does not rely on explanation. It does not need plaques or narration to assert meaning. Its scale, age, and controlled grandeur communicate messages instantly. Endurance, hierarchy, legitimacy. The castle stands as a reminder that monarchy in England has survived not only through laws and lineage, but through the careful construction of symbols that make power feel natural, ancient, and unbroken. Windsor began as a place built to resist attack, not to welcome guests. Its earliest form prioritised height, enclosure, and survival. Thick walls, narrow gateways, and defensible positions defined the castle's logic. Life inside was shaped by readiness, rather than refinement. Spaces were dark, functional, and crowded, designed to house soldiers, store supplies, and endure sieges. Comfort was secondary, and beauty was largely irrelevant. The castle's purpose was clear: to hold territory and project force in a newly conquered land. As the political situation of England stabilised, the need for constant military readiness began to ease. Windsor did not lose its defensive role overnight, but priorities shifted gradually. Kings spent more time there, and with their presence came courtly expectations. A ruler could not govern, negotiate, or display authority effectively from a purely martial environment. Rooms had to accommodate ceremony, councils, and daily royal life. This pressure initiated a slow architectural transformation, where military structures were adapted rather than removed. One of the earliest signs of change was the reworking of interior space. Halls grew larger and more formal, designed not just for feasting but for visibility and hierarchy. The arrangement of seating, elevation of the dais, and control of sightlines allowed power to be staged. These halls still sat within fortified walls, but their function had shifted. They were no longer shelters from attack. They were theatres of authority. The castle learned how to intimidate without fighting. Private royal apartments followed a similar logic. Early medieval rulers lived publicly, sleeping and eating in shared spaces. Over time, Windsor developed zones of increasing privacy. Separate chambers, controlled staircases, and enclosed courtyards allowed the monarch to withdraw from constant exposure. This architectural privacy mirrored changes in kingship itself, as authority became less personal and more institutional. The ruler was still central, but no longer perpetually accessible. Defensive features were not discarded. They were absorbed into the palace. Towers became viewpoints, rather than gun platforms. Walls framed gardens instead of battlements. Gatehouses gained ceremonial importance, marking transition rather than threat. The very elements that once served war were repurposed to structure experience. Visitors passed through layers of architecture that communicated status, ritual, and expectation. Military design quietly became symbolic language. The transformation also required visual refinement. Stonework became more elaborate, windows grew larger, and decorative elements multiplied. Light, once an enemy during sieges, became an ally in display. Architecture began to emphasize order, symmetry, and craftsmanship. Yet this refinement never erased the underlying fortress. The castle retained its mass and gravity, preventing it from slipping into mere luxury. Even as Windsor became more palace than stronghold, it refused to look fragile. Periods of conflict repeatedly tested this balance. Civil war, rebellion, and foreign threat reminded rulers that defense still mattered. Each crisis halted or redirected transformation, reinforcing the need for resilience. As a result, Windsor evolved unevenly, shaped by alternating phases of display and defense. This stop-and-start development produced a structure that carries traces of tension within it, moments where elegance and aggression coexist uncomfortably. What makes Windsor's transformation compelling is that it was never total. The castle did not abandon its identity as a stronghold to become a palace. It layered one role over the other. The military past remained embedded, giving weight to royal display and credibility to ceremony. Visitors sense this duality instinctively. The walls still feel capable of resistance, even as the interiors speak the language of court life. That unresolved tension is not a flaw, but the source of Windsor's enduring authority. Windsor Castle has never belonged to a single ruler. It has belonged to the idea of rulership itself. Over centuries, kings and queens arrived here at moments of power, anxiety, celebration, and retreat. The castle absorbed their routines, fears, ambitions, and silences. Bedrooms were occupied by different bodies, but the rooms outlasted them all. This continuity turned Windsor into something more intimate than a state building and more durable than a personal home. For medieval monarchs, Windsor was a place of presence rather than comfort. A king's household could swell to hundreds of people, filling halls with movement, noise, and hierarchy. Life unfolded in public view. Meals were shared, decisions made openly, and authority reinforced through visibility. Windsor's architecture shaped this exposure. Great halls forced attention toward the monarch, while controlled entrances filtered access. To live here was to be constantly seen, and to be seen was to rule. Queens experienced Windsor differently. The castle provided spaces where influence operated quietly rather than ceremonially. Private chambers, chapels, and enclosed courtyards allowed queens to exercise patronage, manage households, and raise heirs away from the public eye. These areas were not peripheral, they were essential to dynastic survival. Births, illnesses, alliances, and religious devotion unfolded in these rooms, binding the castle to the most vulnerable moments of monarchy. As monarchy evolved, so did domestic life within Windsor. The expectation that rulers should endure constant public exposure began to fade. Privacy became power. Later, kings and queens required spaces that separated governance from personal life. Windsor adapted by expanding residential wings, introducing corridors that limited intrusion and refining the distinction between state and private apartments. The castle learned to host both the performance of monarchy and its retreat. Certain reigns left particularly deep marks. Some monarchs used Windsor as a primary residence, shaping it around their habits and priorities. Others treated it as a seasonal refuge or a symbolic anchor rather than a daily home. Yet even those who stayed briefly contributed to its lived history. Furnishings changed, rooms were repurposed, and traditions layered over older ones. The castle became a record of personal preferences embedded in stone and fabric. Crisis revealed Windsor's role as a true home rather than a ceremonial shell. During periods of instability, monarchs retreated here not to display power, but to endure uncertainty. The castle offered protection, familiarity, and control at moments when authority was challenged elsewhere. In these times, Windsor functioned less like a palace and more like a refuge, reinforcing its emotional significance for the crown. In the modern era, the idea of royal home has grown more complex. Windsor must now balance privacy with visibility, tradition with scrutiny. Kings and queens inhabit it, knowing they are both residents and symbols. Daily life unfolds under layers of protocol, security, and public expectation. Yet the castle continues to fulfill its oldest function, providing a place where rulers live, not just reign. What distinguishes Windsor is not simply that many monarchs have lived there, but that their lives accumulated rather than replaced one another. Each generation inhabited a space already saturated with memory. The castle does not reset between reigns. It carries traces of footsteps, routines and absences, creating a continuity of habitation that transforms monarchy from an abstract institution into a lived experience repeated across centuries. St. George's Chapel sits inside Windsor Castle like a hidden engine of meaning, where stone architecture and living ritual keep feeding each other. It is a church, but it behaves like a court. It is a sacred space, but it also works as a theatre of rank, memory, and allegiance. You can feel that double identity the moment you imagine the layout. Long, high aisles built for procession, not for casual wandering. A choir designed for voices that carry. And a focus on the eastern end, where the most important acts happen in full view. The chapel's Gothic design is not just decorative, it is disciplined. Vertical lines pull the eye upward, making human bodies look smaller and institutions look eternal. Light is carefully controlled, filtering through stained glass, so that the interior never feels neutral, it feels staged. Stone carving becomes a language of authority. Coats of arms, saints, symbols, and repeated emblems turn the building into a ledger of who mattered and who was meant to be remembered. This is architecture that expects witnesses, and it expects them to understand that they are standing inside a story older than any single reign. That story tightens around one of the most unusual institutions in European monarchy, the Order of the Garter. It is often called England's highest order of chivalry, but at Windsor it becomes something more precise, a way to turn loyalty into a permanent, visible form. The order was created in the medieval world where kingship depended on personal bonds as much as laws. A king needed great nobles close, committed and publicly tied to him. The Garter was a solution that looked like romance, saints, vows, rituals, and honour. while functioning like politics, a controlled inner circle, a public ranking system, and a tradition that made service to the crown feel sacred. The most gripping part is how the order is physically embedded into the chapel. The choir stalls are not just seats, they are assigned identities. Each knight or lady companion is linked to a specific stall, and above it their heraldic presence rises. A banner, a crest, a sword, and a metal stall plate that stays even after death. Those plates turn the chapel into a timeline you can read with your eyes. Names and symbols accumulate until the space feels crowded with invisible company, as if the living sit among centuries of predecessors who still claim their place. Procession is the order's heartbeat. The ceremony is not a casual annual tradition. It is an intentional display of continuity where every step is part of the message. The robes, insignia, and formal movement convert individual people into roles: sovereign, companions, officers, each one performing a script refined over generations. At Windsor, procession is power made visible. It shows unity without needing speeches. It shows hierarchy without arguments. And it shows the monarchy as something that can still command disciplined ritual in a modern world that rarely tolerates it. St. George himself matters here, not as a distant legend, but as a chosen symbol. A warrior saint becomes the patron of an order designed to honour courage, loyalty, and service. That symbolism is not accidental. It ties English identity, royal legitimacy, and the idea of rightful authority to a sanctified figure. Inside the chapel, faith and monarchy braid together. Prayers are offered, hymns are sung, and yet the effect is also political, because sacred language makes loyalty sound like duty, and duty sound like destiny. The chapel's survival through religious and political upheaval adds another layer of tension to everything you see. England's religious transformations shook institutions, destroyed images, and rewrote what sacred space could mean. And yet, this place remained central, adapted, and continued. The Order of the Garter did not dissolve into a relic. It kept being used, reinterpreted, and strengthened as a tool of royal identity. That persistence turns every banner and stall plate into evidence that the monarchy can absorb rupture and still present itself as unbroken. Then there is the quiet gravity of burials and memorials. A chapel that hosts pageantry also holds the dead, and that combination changes the emotional temperature of the building. Monarchs and royal figures rest within these walls, close to the rituals that once affirmed their status. The living walk above or beside tombs, while banners hang overhead, as if the institution is reminding everyone that honour has an end point, but tradition does not. Windsor becomes a place where the crown celebrates itself in the same space where it confronts its own mortality. What makes St. George's Chapel and the Order of the Garter so compelling is how they turn abstract concepts, loyalty, continuity, hierarchy, into things you could point to. A stall plate that never leaves, a banner that announces identity without words, a route of procession repeated until it feels inevitable. The chapel does not simply house England's chivalric tradition, it manufactures it, renews it, and keeps it believable by making it tangible, year after year, under the same stone vaults. Royal ceremony at Windsor operates as a form of governance that does not rely on laws or decrees, but on repetition, visibility, and controlled emotion. The castle's spaces are calibrated for ritual movement, courtyards that gather crowds, halls that slow procession, chapels that focus attention forward and upward. Power here is not announced, it is enacted. Every ceremony transforms architecture into a script, guiding bodies, gestures, and silence. so that authority feels inevitable rather than argued. Coronations are not held at Windsor, yet the castle remains deeply embedded in the language of crowning power. Before and after the act of coronation, Windsor functions as a place where kingship is rehearsed, affirmed, and displayed. Monarchs arrive here already crowned, but not yet settled into rule. Investitures, oaths, and early ceremonial appearances at Windsor help translate the abstract moment of coronation into daily authority. The castle becomes the place where symbolic power learns how to live in real space. Funerals reveal an even sharper relationship between ritual and state power. When a monarch or senior royal dies, Windsor does not present grief as private loss. Mourning is structured, paced, and made visible. Processions move slowly through familiar routes, flags and banners lower, bells mark time. The castle frames death not as an interruption of authority, but as part of its continuity. The body disappears, but the institution remains fully choreographed, calm, and unbroken. State rituals at Windsor rely heavily on controlled distance. The public is allowed presence, but never intimacy. Viewpoints are chosen carefully. Who sees what, from where, and for how long. This managed visibility reinforces hierarchy without force. Subjects are reminded that they are included in the moment, but not equal participants. The monarchy appears accessible enough to be legitimate, distant enough to remain elevated. Architecture does much of this work silently, shaping sightlines and movement long before people arrive. Sound plays a crucial role in these ceremonies. Trumpets, hymns, footsteps, and moments of deliberate silence create emotional rhythm. These sounds are not decoration. They structure attention and memory. Silence, especially, carries authority. When hundreds of people fall quiet at a signal, power becomes audible through its absence. Windsor's enclosed spaces amplified this effect, making collective stillness feel heavy and deliberate rather than accidental. Uniform, dress, and insignia further bind ceremony to state power. Military presence is not primarily about defense. It is about order. Precision movement, aligned bodies, and identical gestures communicate stability. At Windsor, these visual elements merge with centuries-old ritual forms, collapsing past and present into a single image. Modern state authority borrows credibility from medieval tradition, while tradition gains relevance by being actively used, rather than preserved behind glass. Religious ritual deepens this fusion of ceremony and governance. Services held in St. George's Chapel combine prayer with allegiance, faith with state continuity. Even in a secular age, sacred language lends gravity that legal language cannot. Blessings, hymns, and liturgical rhythms slow time, making moments feel larger than politics. The monarchy draws strength from this overlap, presenting itself not just as a constitutional role, but as part of a moral and historical order. What makes Windsor distinct is that these ceremonies are not rare interruptions of daily life. They are woven into the castle's ongoing function. Staff, guards, clergy, and officials rehearse roles repeatedly, turning ritual into habit. The castle does not wait for history to happen. It prepares for it. Through ceremony, Windsor converts change, crowning, mourning, transition, into controlled continuity, ensuring that state power never appears sudden, fragile, or improvised. Windsor's stone looks timeless, but its daily reality has often been shaped by fear. In periods of civil conflict, a castle stops being a symbol and becomes a calculation. Who can hold it? How long it can resist? And what it means if it falls? During England's internal struggles, Windsor's value lay in its position and its layered defences. Control of the castle meant control of a strategic corridor near London, and the mere fact of its occupation could signal which side claimed legitimate authority. Even when fighting moved elsewhere, Windsor mattered as a secure base, a storehouse, and a visible reminder that the crown, whoever held it, still had a fortress that could not be ignored. Crisis also changes what royal residence means. In calmer centuries, a monarch might come to Windsor for ceremony or retreat. In danger, the castle becomes a bunker with a court attached. Movement is restricted, entrances tighten, and routine turns into security procedure. The castle's geography, wards within wards, gates within gates, naturally supports this shift. It can be locked down in layers, creating zones of safety that are difficult to penetrate. In those moments, Windsor feels less like a palace with defensive features, and more like an engineered refuge that happens to carry a crown's history inside it. The world wars forced a different kind of transformation, one that modern viewers often underestimate. A medieval castle cannot stop a bomb in the way a modern shelter can, yet it offers something priceless during total war: controlled access, secrecy, and a culture of protection that has been practiced for centuries. Windsor's routines adapted to blackouts and heightened security. The threat was no longer a siege tower or an army at the gates, but the sky itself. What had once been designed to resist assault from the ground now had to endure the psychological pressure of modern war, uncertainty, sudden catastrophe, and the knowledge that tradition could burn in a single night. That is where Windsor's second identity becomes vital. A place not only of power, but of custody. When crisis rises, the monarchy's most precious objects stop being decorations and become national liabilities. Targets, bargaining chips, irreplaceable losses waiting to happen. Artworks, ceremonial items, rare books, and historic furnishings are not just valuable. They are concentrated history. In wartime, protecting them becomes a form of statecraft. Decisions have to be made quickly. What can be moved? What must be hidden? What can be packed without damage? What can survive damp, darkness, and time? Windsor's role as a container for royal collections turns the castle into a quiet museum that still breathes. The collections are not assembled like a public gallery designed around labels and open access. They are woven into rooms that must also function as living spaces and ceremonial settings. Paintings hang where decisions are made. Porcelain sits where guests dine. Furniture becomes both heritage and tool. This creates a strange tension. Objects meant to last are used by people who must live, host, walk, touch, and inhabit. Conservation is not an abstract principle here. It is a daily negotiation between preservation and use. The idea of treasure at Windsor is also more layered than gold and jewels. It includes images that define how monarchy sees itself. Portraits that rehearse power, allegories that flatter rule, artifacts that connect a present monarch to centuries of predecessors. Collection becomes a kind of memory management. What is displayed, what is stored, and what is brought out for specific moments shapes public perception. In that sense, Windsor doesn't simply house art, it uses art to frame monarchy as cultured, continuous, and legitimate, even when politics outside the walls are chaotic. In the present day, Windsor operates in a world that expects transparency, while still demanding mystique. It must function under constant attention, media, tourism, security scrutiny, yet it cannot become a theme park without losing its authority. Modern monarchy needs places that feel real, not staged, but also places that can still host ritual at the highest level. Windsor supplies that contradiction. It can be closed, guarded, and made private within minutes, and it can also be opened, curated, and performed in front of the world with equal efficiency. Behind the scenes, living history means infrastructure that no medieval builder imagined. Climate control to protect textiles and paintings. Fire prevention systems designed to stop a disaster before it becomes a headline. Routes and protocols that move staff, officials, and visitors without letting the building collapse into chaos. Every modern upgrade has to be threaded through ancient constraints, often hidden so the castle keeps its illusion of permanence. The result is a hybrid organism, a fortress past, a museum present, a residence now, all operating at once. Windsor today survives by doing what it has always done in crisis, adapting without announcing adaptation. It absorbs modernity quietly, preserves art while still living among it, and keeps ceremonial power credible by placing it inside a structure that has endured threats far more brutal than criticism. In war, it becomes a shield. In peace, it becomes a stage, and in the everyday rhythm of modern monarchy, it becomes something rarer than either, a place where history is not visited, but inhabited.